No, there are such moments in history when everything hangs by a thread. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a cliff. The wind sways you from one side to the other, and any movement can change everything. The winter of 42-43 became exactly such a moment. The world was balancing between two realities, and in one of them, it swayed in the wrong direction. Let me tell you how this could have happened, not like in a textbook, dryly and point by point, but as if we were sitting around a campfire, and I was sharing with you one of the most terrifying alternative histories that one can imagine. It all begins in the ruins of a city on the Volga, Stalingrad, a name that, in our reality, became a symbol of inflexibility, the beginning of the end for the Nazis. But imagine a different picture. Imagine that in that frosty November, everything went differently. Paulus's Sixth Army, surrounded by Soviet troops, did not surrender. The German command made a different decision, not to wait for the soldiers to freeze and run out of ammunition. They threw all reserves into breaking the ring. Army Group Don, commanded by Manstein, broke through the defense earlier than in our history, when the Soviet troops had not yet managed to consolidate their new positions. And here is the first crack in reality. The encirclement is lifted. The German troops, exhausted but not destroyed, retreat to new positions. This is not a victory for the Wehrmacht. It is simply the absence of their crushing defeat. But the psychological effect is enormous. The Soviet command loses the initiative it had been building for months. The spring of 43 brings new trials. The Battle of Kursk unfolds completely differently in this reality. The Germans, who did not lose their best divisions at Stalingrad, strike with unprecedented force. New tanks, which they managed to produce in greater numbers, break through the defense. The battle turns not into a triumph of Soviet defense, but into a bloody mess where both sides bleed, but the Red Army loses more, much more. You see, in war, there is such a thing as morale. An army that knows it is winning fights completely differently from one that begins to doubt. And when, in the autumn of 43, the Soviet troops, bled white by endless attacks, begin to slowly retreat, these doubts spread like cracks across the ice. But this is only one side of the coin. Let's move to the west, where the Allies are preparing a grandiose operation, the landing in Normandy. The 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, which was supposed to change the course of the war. Only in this alternative reality, something goes wrong. Perhaps the weather was slightly worse, and the landing is delayed by a few days. Perhaps German intelligence worked better, and Rommel managed to move tank divisions to the coast earlier. Or perhaps, and this is the most terrifying, the Germans managed to complete their secret weapon. Imagine the scene. Allied forces are landing on the beaches of Normandy. The first wave, the second, the third. Losses are enormous, but the beachhead is seized. And suddenly, a flash of light, brighter than 1,000 suns. Not in Japan, as it was in our history, but here, in Europe. The German atomic bomb, which they managed to create a few months before the Americans. It sounds incredible, doesn't it? But all alternative history is built on subtle assumptions. What if Heisenberg did not make a mistake in his calculations? What if the Germans did not lose their best physicists who emigrated to America? What if the Norwegian heavy water from the Vemork plant fell into their hands sooner? One explosion, and tens of thousands of Allied soldiers vanish in an instant. A second one, and the fleet retreats in panic. A third one, and Churchill understands that he has no more aces up his sleeve. Britain stands 30 kilometers from an enemy who now possesses the doomsday weapon. Let's return to the east. The spring of 45. The Red Army, which in our reality took Berlin, is here rolling back to the Dnieper. Troops are exhausted. Industry in the Urals does not have time to replenish equipment losses. And then news arrives from the west. The Allies are defeated. Britain is on the verge of capitulation. Imagine what Stalin felt at that moment. He understood. He was left alone against a machine that could now unleash atomic fire upon any city. Moscow, Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, any of them could be next. And this is not just a threat. It is a reality confirmed by the ashes of Normandy. April of 45. It is not Soviet troops entering Berlin, but German representatives arriving in neutral Sweden to sign a treaty on the capitulation of the USSR. Not a complete one, no. Hitler wants to maintain the appearance of magnanimity. Territories up to the Urals, including Moscow and Leningrad, fall under the control of the Reich. The rest are formally independent states under German patronage. Can you imagine that day? The silence in the Kremlin when the document is signed. Millions of people who woke up in one country and went to sleep in another. But this is not the end yet. Britain holds on with its last strength. London is in ruins after months of bombing with conventional and new missiles, V3, V4, which did not exist in our reality. The royal family is evacuated to Canada. Churchill, the old lion, understands that fighting further means condemning the island to total annihilation. June of 45. Another signing, another capitulation. Britain withdraws from the war. Not defeated in the direct sense, the Germans did not land on the islands, but broken morally, economically, politically. And here it is, the New World. Germany from the Atlantic to the Urals. Japan dominates Asia. America, shocked by what is happening, hides behind the ocean, realizing that on the other side of the planet, a monster has been born with which it is not ready to fight. Not now, maybe never. The point of no return has been passed. History turned into a dark alley from which there is no easy exit. And it all began with one snowy winter in a city on the Volga, when fate swayed by a thread and chose a different path. That's how it all could have happened. Scary, isn't it? It is good that this is only an alternative history. Or were we just lucky to live in a different reality? Do you remember playing Monopoly as a child? You roll the dice, buy properties, build hotels. The winner takes all, and the losers are left with nothing. So, imagine the same game, only instead of a game board, it's the entire planet, and the stakes are the fates of millions of people. The summer of 45. The smoke over Europe has not yet cleared, and the victors have already sat down at the table to divide the world. Not in Yalta, as it was in our reality, but somewhere in Berlin, in the pompous hall of the new Reich Chancellery, under the eagles with swastikas. 3 are at the table: Germany, Japan, and Italy. The 3 Axis powers that have just overturned history. Do you know what the scariest thing is? They already had a plan ready. Not improvised on the fly, not an impromptu decision, no. Everything was planned out even before the war, as if a director had written the script in advance for a play in which millions of people were destined to become extras. Germany takes the biggest piece, from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. Can you imagine the scale? All of Europe, the entire European part of the former Union. This territory is larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, larger than Napoleon's possessions, larger than anything the world has seen in the last 1,000 years. But the Germans did not just want to control these lands, they wanted to remake them. Do you remember I mentioned the plan? It was called Ost, simply East in German. Sounds mundane, doesn't it? As if it were about an economic plan or a development program. In fact, it was an instruction for the reorganization of half a continent. Here is how it worked. Berlin officials sat in warm offices with maps and colored pencils. They drew lines, put check marks, made notes. This area, to be cleared. Here, to settle German colonists. Here, to create model farms. It sounds almost harmless until you realize that by the word cleared, they meant the fate of 31 million people. 31 million. Try to grasp that number. That is the population of an entire large country. All these people were planned to be evicted, some to Siberia, some further east, and many were simply not supposed to remain. Instead, German settlers were supposed to come, about 10 million people, farmers from Germany, Austria, Scandinavian countries. Each was promised a plot of land, about 30 hectares each. Imagine, a German peasant from Bavaria suddenly receives a farm somewhere near Smolensk or in Crimea. He does not know what happened to those who lived there before him, or he knows, and he does not care. New administrative units grew up in place of the former Union, Reichskommissariats, a boring bureaucratic word for occupied territories. Ostland, the Baltic states, and Belarus. Ukraine, it is clear what that is. Muscovy, central Russia with Moscow and Leningrad. Caucasus, the southern territories with their oil fields. At the head of each Reichskommissariat stood a Reichskommissar, a governor who had absolute power, more than the governor-generals of Tsarist Russia, more than the Roman proconsuls. He could execute, pardon, relocate entire villages with a stroke of a pen. Moscow and Leningrad, the two cities that were symbols of Soviet power, turned into provincial centers, stripped of all grandeur. They wanted to rename Moscow, demolish the Kremlin, and build something monumentally Nazi in its place. Leningrad was generally planned to be razed to the ground, and an artificial lake created in its place. A ghost city, a memory city. But Germany could not take everything. They had to share with their allies, although the word allies sounds too friendly here. Rather, they were competitors who temporarily agreed not to interfere with each other. Japan received its piece of the pie in the East. They had a beautiful term, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? Co-prosperity, harmony. Only in practice, this meant the Japanese occupation of half of Asia. China turned into a puppet state where all decisions are made in Tokyo. Korea, which they had captured back at the beginning of the century, is finally integrated into the empire. Indochina, the Philippines, Indonesia, everything is under Japanese control. And now add the Far East and Siberia up to the Urals to that. Imagine, from the Pacific Ocean to the Ural Mountains, the Japanese sphere of influence. The resources of Siberia, oil, gas, timber, metals, all of it now fuels the Japanese war machine. Japanese officials in Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, Japanese soldiers on the streets of Irkutsk. The local population is turned into third-rate labor. Tokyo and Berlin agreed on the division of spheres of influence during the war. 70 degrees east longitude, roughly along the Ural line, became the border between the German and Japanese worlds. To the west, the swastika; to the east, the rising sun. Two predators divided the prey and retreated to their corners, glancing at each other with mistrust. And what about Italy? The third participant in the victorious alliance looked almost comical next to the two giants. If Germany and Japan bit off huge chunks, the Italians got the scraps. The Mediterranean, that was Mussolini's dream. To recreate the Roman Empire, to turn the Mediterranean Sea into our sea, Mare Nostrum, as the ancient Romans said. Italy gained control over North Africa. Libya expanded at the expense of Egyptian territories. Tunisia and part of Algeria were added. In the Balkans, Dalmatia, Albania, Greece under Italian protectorate. Mussolini reveled in his new possessions, planning to turn Rome into the center of a new empire. But everyone understood, including the Duce himself, that Italy was now the junior partner, a vassal of Germany. Too weak economically, too dependent on German resources and military power. On the territories of the former Union, puppet states also arose, formally independent but completely controlled by Berlin. In Ukraine, some semblance of a national government was created from collaborators. In the Caucasus, local elites were allowed to play at independence, provided that oil flowed to Germany. In Central Asia, the Japanese installed their own protégés. These governments were like theatrical backdrops. They look beautiful from afar, but come closer, and you see that there is nothing behind the plywood facades. They had flags, coats of arms, even armies. But the real power remained in the hands of German advisors and Japanese commissars. A new system of international relations was built. At the top of the pyramid, Germany and Japan, two superpowers, each controlling its half of Eurasia. Below, satellites like Italy, puppet regimes, occupied territories. And somewhere across the ocean, in isolation and fear, the United States, which no longer decides anything in world politics. By the end of the 1940s, the world map looked as if it had been drawn by a madman. Familiar borders were erased, old states disappeared, new ones arose at the whim of the victors. Europe from Lisbon to Moscow speaks German or is learning to speak it. Asia from Tokyo to the Urals lives by the laws of the Japanese military regime. You ask, what about the people? What happened to the ordinary people who woke up one morning in this new world? About this, the next story, about how millions became hostages of someone else's will, how fates were ruined and lives were broken. But that is already another heavy and terrible chapter. In the meantime, remember this picture. The world is divided, borders are drawn, a new order is established. An order built on blood and fear. An order that seemed eternal to the victors. They did not yet know that any empire carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. How did the victors divide the world among themselves? Beautiful lines on maps, percentages, territories. Everything looked so mundane, almost businesslike. But now let's talk about what was happening on the ground, where those lines passed through someone's homes, fates, lives. Imagine an ordinary morning somewhere near Smolensk or in a Ukrainian village. The spring of '46. The sun rises, the birds sing, the world seems to have woken up after a nightmare. Only the nightmare has not ended. It is only just beginning in earnest. There is a knock on the door. You open it. People in uniform are standing there with documents, and they say, "You have 3 days. Pack your things. You are being resettled." Where? Beyond the Urals, to Siberia, where the ground freezes for several meters, where winter lasts half a year, where the nearest settlement is 100 kilometers away. But this is our home. We were born here. Our parents are buried here. You have 3 days. This is not a fiction or an exaggeration. The plan provided for the eviction of 31 million people. 31 million. Try to comprehend this number. It's as if all of Canada or Poland were suddenly removed from their place and driven into the unknown. Women, old people, children, no exceptions were made. The process went in waves, like a tide that slowly but inexorably advances. First, the inhabitants of the western regions were evicted, those considered most suitable for German colonization. The Baltic states, western Ukraine, the fertile lands of Kuban. Then the turn came for the central regions. By the end of the 1940s, tens of millions were supposed to have gone through this meat grinder. Echelons went one after the other, freight cars crammed with people like cattle, weeks on the road, sometimes months. They stopped somewhere in an open field. That's it, you've arrived. Here is your new homeland. No houses, no roads, no infrastructure. Survive as you know how. Many did not survive, and others came to the liberated lands. German colonists, families of farmers from Bavaria, Württemberg, East Prussia. They were promised mountains of gold, 30 to 40 hectares of land per family, a house, inventory, benefits, an eastern paradise for true Aryans. By the end of the 1940s, about 10 million Germans were planned to be resettled in the East. Imagine this scene. A German farmer enters someone's house. Photographs of the former owners still hang on the walls. Their clothes are in the closet. Their supplies are in the cellar. Everything is ready, just live. Does he know that someone lived here before him? Of course. Does he care? He has been instilled with the belief that this land always belonged to the Germans, and the locals were temporary inhabitants who were rightly returned to their historical homeland, somewhere in the east. But not everyone was evicted. Some were left behind, those who were needed. Working hands were required, and quite a few. Factories, mines, fields, all of this would not work by itself. And here began another story, the story of how entire nations were turned into slaves. The system was thought out to the smallest detail. The population was divided into categories by racial characteristics. Germans and Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans, at the top. Everything for them, the best houses, work, education. Below, conditionally Aryan peoples, Balts, some Ukrainians. They were allowed to live relatively well if they were Germanized, learned German, changed their names, forgot their culture. The Baltic states were Germanized especially actively. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians were considered racially sound enough for assimilation, teaching in schools only in German. Young people were taken into German youth organizations where everything national was beaten out of them and Nazi ideology was instilled. In a generation or two, only the surnames of the Estonians and Latvians were supposed to remain, and those too would be Germanized. With the Russians, Belarusians, and most Ukrainians, there was no ceremony. This was the class of working cattle. Passports with special marks, restrictions on movement, a ban on education above the primary level. Their children did not have the right to study more than 4 grades, just enough to be able to read orders and count to 100. They worked for German masters, on those same German farms that arose in place of their villages, in factories that now belonged to German concerns, in mines where coal and ore were extracted for the Reich. Symbolic wages, no rights, any disobedience, concentration camp or execution on the spot. Large German corporations threw a real party. Krupp, Thyssen, IG Farben. All the giants of German industry received lucrative chunks of the Soviet economy. The coal mines of Donbass, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the metallurgical plants of the Urals. All of this now worked to enrich German industrialists. Moreover, these enterprises did not work for the development of the local economy. Everything was exported to Germany. Raw materials, metal, food, the flow went in only one direction. The occupied territories turned into a vast colony from which everything was squeezed out to the last drop. Something was restored from the ruins of the war, but only what was necessary for pumping out resources. Moscow and Leningrad, the 2 cities that were the pride of the country, became shadows of themselves. Moscow was renamed. The exact name varied in different plans, but the essence was the same: to erase the memory of the Soviet past. They wanted to demolish the Kremlin, but then decided to turn it into a museum, a demonstration of victory over the barbarians. German officials, soldiers, and police now walked the streets of the former capital. Russians, and those who remained, were not evicted beyond the Urals, huddled on the outskirts, working as janitors, porters, servants. The city on 7 hills, which for centuries had been the heart of a huge state, turned into a provincial administrative center of one of the Reichskommissariats. Leningrad was planned to be treated even more harshly, razed to the ground, flooded, creating a lake. But in the end, they decided to keep it as a port necessary for exporting timber and other resources from the north. Peter's City, the cradle of the revolution, a place where history was made, became an ordinary port town with a German name and German regulations. Each of the Reichskommissariats lived by its own rules, but the essence was the same. Ostland, the Baltic states, and Belarus was actively Germanized. Ukraine was divided, the western part for Germanization, the eastern part, a working zone for resource extraction. Muscovy, central Russia, turned into a huge reserve of labor. The Caucasus, an oil pump for the Reich. Local administration formally existed: burgomasters, elders, local police, collaborators who betrayed their own for scraps from the German table. But the real power always remained in the hands of German commissars and their apparatus. All important decisions were made in Berlin or in the residences of the Reichskommissars. By the end of the 1940s, the picture stabilized. Where the Soviet Union had recently been, a mosaic of occupied territories, puppet states, colonies. People who remembered another life told their children in whispers, "It used to be different." But the children already barely understood how it could have been otherwise. The new reality was becoming the norm. This was a world built on injustice and violence, a world where millions of people woke up as outcasts in their own land, where strangers dictated the rules, and your life no longer belonged to you. You know, there's a thing about dictators. They all dream of eternity, that their regime, their empire, will survive the ages. They build monuments, write constitutions, create systems that should stand for 1,000 years. And in this alternative reality, by the end of the 1940s, early 1950s, the German Reich really began to look like something indestructible. Imagine an empire that stretches from the gray waters of the Atlantic to the snowy peaks of the Urals, from the fjords of Norway to the sun-scorched beaches of Crimea, the largest empire in European history. And it does not just exist, it is being built, rebuilt, changing right before your eyes. Let's start with how all this was governed. The political structure of the expanded Reich was something between an empire and a corporation. At the top, of course, the Führer, but beneath him, an extensive system of Reichskommissariats, governor-generalships, protectorates, each with its own rules, each with its own degree of autonomy, but all under strict control from the center. Berlin became not just the capital, it turned into the administrative heart of the continent. Reports flowed here from all corners of the empire, and orders were dispatched from here. A huge bureaucratic apparatus, millions of documents, entire skyscrapers of ministries. The system worked with German punctuality. Every certificate, every piece of paper in its place, but politics is boring. Let's rather talk about what could be seen, because the Nazis were obsessed with visuals, with spectacle. It was not enough for them just to rule. They wanted everyone to see their grandeur. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Do you remember I said that dictators dream of eternity? So Hitler dreamed of a city that would survive the ages. He called it Germania, simply and straightforwardly. The New Berlin, the capital of the world, a city that was supposed to eclipse Rome, Paris, London. The plan was grandiose to the point of madness. In the center, the Great Hall, a huge dome 320 meters high, capable of holding 180,000 people. 320 meters. That is almost twice as high as St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The dome would be so large that clouds would form inside it from the crowd's breath. Imagine this picture. You are standing in the square, craning your head up. The dome goes up into the sky, so huge that it seems it cannot be the work of human hands. Above, an eagle with a swastika, visible for kilometers. And inside, a hall where the voice of one person is amplified so that 200,000 hear him. A temple of the new religion where the Führer was God. A triumphal avenue was supposed to stretch from the Great Hall, 5 kilometers long, 120 meters wide. For comparison, the Champs-Élysées in Paris is 70 meters. At one end, the Great Hall; at the other, the Triumphal Arch, so enormous that the Parisian one would fit inside it entirely, 117 meters high. By the early 1950s, these projects were no longer just drawings on paper. Construction was in full swing. Thousands of workers, many of them forcibly rounded up from occupied territories, toiled day and night. Entire blocks of old Berlin were demolished by bulldozers. Monuments of the new era grew up in their place. But Berlin was not the only city being rebuilt. Model German cities sprang up throughout the empire. The architecture was the same everywhere, strict, monumental, oppressive in its scale. Squares the size of football fields, buildings made of gray stone, huge columns. Everything created the feeling that man was small and insignificant before the grandeur of the state. And the Nazis were building roads. Oh, these roads. Autobahns, high-speed highways that connected the empire into one whole. By the early 1950s, the Autobahn network stretched for thousands of kilometers. Perfectly smooth, four-lane, they cut through space like a knife. The most ambitious project, the Autobahn from Berlin to the Urals, 3,500 kilometers. Imagine, you get in a car in the German capital and drive through Poland, Belarus, Russia, to the very Ural Mountains, and all the way under your wheels is perfect German asphalt, a symbol of the conquest of space, a symbol of total control. These roads were built not just for cars. They were strategic arteries. Troops, equipment, and resources could be quickly transferred along them. Some sections were even designed to be used as runways for aircraft if necessary. The empire's economy hummed like a well-oiled machine. Resources from the east, coal, oil, metals, timber, flowed continuously to the west, into the industrial heart of Germany. There they were turned into equipment, weapons, goods. Part returned to the east, but the greater part remained in the metropolis. By the early 1950s, Germany had become an economic giant. Factories worked at full capacity. Unemployment did not exist, for Germans, of course. The standard of living for the average Aryan was high. His own house, a car, the people's car, the Volkswagen, a machine for recreation and entertainment. All this was accessible. True, few thought about the price, that their well-being was built on the looting of half a continent, on the labor of millions of slaves. Propaganda worked flawlessly. People were instilled with the belief that they deserved this by their racial affiliation. But the most amazing thing is technology. German engineers had made an incredible leap forward by the 1950s. Do you remember the V rockets, cruise and ballistic? In our reality, they appeared late in the war, too late to change its course. Here, the Germans had time to perfect them. By the 1950s, the rocket program had taken a big step forward. Ballistic missiles could now reach any point in Europe in minutes. Cruise missiles became more accurate and longer range. And most importantly, the Germans were working on a space program. Space. Imagine, 1952 or 1953, and German engineers led by von Braun, who in this reality did not go to America, launched the first satellite. A metal sphere with a swastika circles the planet, transmitting signals. A triumph of German science, a demonstration of might. Jet aviation also developed by leaps and bounds. The first jet fighters appeared during the war, but now they became the norm. By the 1950s, jet passenger planes were flying in the skies over the empire, fast, comfortable, accessible to the elite. The atomic program continued to develop. After the first bombs, work proceeded on atomic power plants, on more powerful weapons. Germany held the secret of atomic fission and was not going to share it with anyone. Life in the model German cities was a strange mixture of comfort and control. On the one hand, modern amenities, clean streets, working transport. On the other, total surveillance. In every quarter, a party overseer. On every corner, posters with propaganda. On the radio, state-approved broadcasts. Education turned into a system of indoctrination. Children learned from an early age that Aryans were the superior race, that the Führer was a genius, that the empire would last 1,000 years. History was rewritten, facts were distorted, critical thinking was suppressed. Young people grew up in a world where truth was what the state said. Culture and art existed within rigid frameworks. Everything had to glorify the regime, extol Aryan beauty, demonstrate the nation's grandeur. Modernism was declared degenerative art. Jazz was banned. Instead, monumental canvases with heroic scenes, solemn classical music, plays about the exploits of German soldiers. The social structure was simple and rigid. At the top, the Aryan elite, party functionaries, industrialists, officers. They had everything: power, money, privileges. Below, ordinary Germans, workers, and peasants. They lived well enough if they kept their heads down. Even lower, the other peoples of the empire, each on their step according to racial theory. And at the very bottom, Slavs, forced laborers, whose lives were worth nothing. By the early 1950s, the empire looked indestructible. Monumental cities, modern technologies, a powerful economy. An entire generation grew up not knowing another life. For them, this was a normal world, a world of order, strength, grandeur. But in this brilliance and might, the seeds of future problems were already hidden. An economy built on plunder cannot grow forever. A system based on fear and violence gives rise to resistance. Peoples turned into slaves do not forget freedom. For now, in the early 1950s, it seemed that the 1,000-year Reich would indeed stand for 1,000 years. Eagles with swastikas gazed from skyscrapers upon the subjugated continent, and few imagined how all this could collapse. When an entire world collapses, it does not disappear instantly. It crumbles differently for different people. For someone, it is the end of everything. For someone else, it is a strange opportunity to survive by adapting. And for others, a slow fading, stretched over years. Let's talk about how this happened to each of the peoples of the former Union in this nightmarish reality. Let's start with the Russians, the most numerous people of the empire that ceased to exist. For them, the new order was especially cruel. Nazi racial theory placed Slavs on one of the lower steps of the human ladder, above only Jews and Gypsies. Untermenschen, subhumans, that's what they called them. Imagine waking up in a world where your life is officially worth less than that of a representative of another nationality, where on your passport, if you were issued a passport at all, there is a special mark that determines your entire destiny. The fourth category. This is not just a number, it is a sentence. Russians were forbidden to receive education above primary level. 4 grades. To learn to read simple orders, count to 100, sign your name. Enough to work, not enough to think. Universities were closed, libraries destroyed or turned into storage for German books. Even the Russian language was slowly being squeezed out. All official documentation was only in German. Work, only physical, only low-skilled. Factories, mines, construction sites, fields. German masters paid pennies, just enough not to starve. Union rights, labor laws. It is ridiculous even to speak of. Any attempt at protest was punished instantly. Concentration camp or execution on the spot. Movement was restricted. If you want to move to another city, you need special permission, which is almost impossible to get. Curfew, a ban on gatherings of more than 3 people. Even weddings took place under the supervision of the German police. God forbid too many people gather. By the end of the 1940s, many Russians had turned into a silent mass of labor. Without a past, it was erased. Without a future, it was not anticipated. Only an endless present, day after day, shift after shift at the factory or in the mine. With the Ukrainians, everything was more complex, and in some ways, more insidious. The Nazis decided to use an old imperial tactic, divide and conquer. Ukraine was divided into parts, and each received its place in the new hierarchy. Western Ukraine, Galicia, Volhynia, was considered more racially suitable. Germanization was active here. Children were taken to special schools where Ukrainian identity was beaten out of them and German identity was instilled. Fair-haired children, fitting the Aryan standards, were sometimes taken away to Germany. They were adopted by German families, given new names, a new history. The local elite, those who agreed to cooperate, were allowed to play at autonomy. A puppet government with Ukrainian flags and coats of arms, but all key decisions were made in the German administration. Collaborators received scraps of power and better rations. For this, they had to keep their compatriots in check. Eastern Ukraine, the industrial Donbass, turned into a huge working zone. Mines, factories, everything worked for the Reich. The local population, working cattle, no better than the Russians. No Germanization, no illusions. Only labor until exhaustion. Belarusians found themselves in a particularly difficult situation. Their lands became the arena of the most brutal punitive operations. Why? Because it was here that the most powerful partisan movement unfolded. And the Germans responded to this mercilessly. 140 punitive operations in Belarus alone. Entire villages were burned to the ground along with the residents. Cotton, not the only one. There were hundreds of such instances. Did they suspect that someone was helping the partisans? The entire village, men, women, children, were driven into a barn and set on fire, or shot on the spot. Deportations went in a continuous stream. 75% of the population was planned to be evicted to Siberia, beyond the Urals, anywhere, just to make room for German colonists. 10%, the intelligentsia, teachers, doctors, anyone who could organize resistance, were to be destroyed immediately. The remaining 15% to be Germanized, turned into Germans, stripped of the memory of their roots. The Balts found themselves in a privileged position, as much as that word is applicable in such a context. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians were considered racially sound, enough by the Nazis for assimilation. The second or third category, according to their classification, not purebred Aryans, but close to it. A special program was developed for them. Cultural assimilation sounds mild, doesn't it? In reality, it meant the destruction of everything national, a ban on celebrating Independence Day, a ban on national anthems and flags. The Russian words liberation and independence were erased from the lexicon. Schools were switched to German as the language of instruction. Young people were enrolled in German youth organizations. There they were taught to march under the swastika, sing Nazi songs, and despise the lower races. Ethnic Germans in the Baltic states were given all key posts. They became overseers over their former neighbors. But there was also the dark side of the deal. The Balts were allowed to feel slightly superior to others, provided they did the dirty work for the Germans. Latvians and Lithuanians participated in punitive operations in Belarus, guarded concentration camps, and helped deport the population. They were instilled with the belief, you are special, you are not like these Russians. And some believed it, selling their souls for the illusion of superiority. The Caucasus received its own version of occupation policy. The Germans created puppet governments there, formally independent states under German patronage. Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, each with its own flag, its own president from the local collaborators. But independence was a fiction. Baku oil flowed to Germany. Decisions were made by German advisors. Local elites were allowed to wear national costumes and give speeches about revival, as long as they ensured the smooth operation of the oil rigs and marched in step with the occupiers, the Jews. For them, this alternative reality meant the completion of the nightmare that began even before the war. The final solution to the Jewish question. That's what the Nazis called their plan for the systematic destruction of the entire Jewish population of Europe. In our reality, the Holocaust claimed 6 million lives, a monstrous figure. But the Nazis lost the war, and some managed to escape. In this alternative history, where they had more time, where there was no liberation, the program was carried out to completion. By the early 1950s, practically no one was left in the territory of the former USSR. Gas chambers, execution pits, starvation in ghettos, the death machine worked methodically and non-stop. The Germans gave Central Asia to the Japanese. It was part of their sphere of influence. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, All of this was now under Tokyo's control. The Japanese occupation was no less cruel. Resources were exported, the population was used as cheap labor. Japanese military administrators ruled with an iron fist. But the scariest thing in this whole system is not just the cruelty, not just the exploitation. It was an attempt to destroy the very memory of who these peoples were. The systematic destruction of culture. The intelligentsia, writers, scientists, artists, teachers, were destroyed first. They were the bearers of cultural memory. They were the ones who could maintain the connection between generations. Mass executions in the first months of the occupation. Lists were compiled in advance. They were used to search for and catch everyone who had a higher education, who published, who taught. Books were burned, libraries were ruined, monuments were demolished. Russian literature, Ukrainian poetry, Belarusian songs were supposed to be replaced by emptiness or German propaganda. But people resisted, despite everything. In the forests of Belarus, in the mountains of the Caucasus, even in the cities under the occupiers' noses, partisan detachments and underground groups operated. Partisans blew up bridges, derailed trains, set up ambushes for German patrols. Underground workers in cities distributed leaflets, passed intelligence data, and sabotaged work for the occupiers. For every captured partisan, the Germans shot 10 hostages. For every act of sabotage, they burned a village. But the resistance did not stop. By the early 1950s, the picture had stabilized but had not become calm. Yes, the system worked. Yes, passports with racial categories were handed out. The population was divided into castes. Cultures were suppressed. But beneath this external obedience, resistance smoldered. Old people told children stories about the past, in whispers, at night. Mothers sang lullabies in their native language, although it was dangerous. Underground teachers taught children the true history, risking their lives. The memory of a people cannot be killed completely. It can be suppressed. It can be driven deep inside. But it remains and awaits its hour, like a smoldering coal under the ashes that can burst into flames at the first breath of wind. There is a saying, "Old Lady Europe." For centuries, she considered herself the center of civilization, the cradle of culture, the beacon of progress. And now this old lady found herself under the boot. From the Atlantic to the Polish plains, from the Norwegian fjords to the Greek islands, flags with swastikas flew everywhere, only everywhere differently. You know, occupation is not just when foreign soldiers walk your streets. It is when every nation is deprived of the right to its own destiny. Only some are subjected to this crudely and cruelly, and others with a smile and promises. Let's look at how this looked in different parts of the continent. Let's start with France, a country that always prided itself on its independence, its culture, its special place in the world. After the surrender in 1941, it was divided into two parts, the North and the Atlantic coast, under direct German occupation. The South, a formally independent state with its capital in the resort town of Vichy. The Vichy regime, that is a special form of betrayal, wrapped in beautiful packaging. Marshal Pétain, a hero of the First World War whom the French idolized, stood at its head, an old man who spoke of the honor and dignity of France. And this same old man signed orders for the deportation of Jews to German death camps, for collaboration with the occupiers, for fulfilling any demands from Berlin. By the end of the 1940s, when all of France was under German control, the Vichy regime finally turned into a puppet. Formally, the French governed themselves, but all important decisions were made in the German administration. French police caught members of the resistance, French enterprises worked for the needs of the Reich, French workers went to Germany for forced labor. France was obliged to pay 400 million francs daily for the maintenance of the occupation forces. 400 million, every day. The country's economy was squeezed like a lemon. All the best went to Germany. The French were left with scraps. Paris, the city of light, the capital of fashion and art, turned into a German garrison city. German officers drank coffee in Parisian cafes, walked along the Champs-Élysées, took photos in front of the Eiffel Tower. German soldiers marched in the streets, and the flag with the swastika flew over the Arc de Triomphe. But not everyone submitted. The resistance movement in France was one of the strongest in Europe. Underground workers operated in the cities, printing leaflets, passing intelligence to the Allies who had taken refuge across the ocean, sabotaging work for the Germans. In the countryside, partisans, called maquis, hid in forests and mountains, set up ambushes, blew up bridges. General de Gaulle, who refused to acknowledge the surrender and fled to London, became a symbol of unbroken France. His organization, Free France, coordinated the resistance from within. The Germans hunted down underground workers mercilessly. Those caught were tortured, shot, sent to concentration camps. But the resistance did not die. Great Britain did not stand firm in this alternative reality. After the German use of atomic weapons in Normandy and months of continuous bombing, the island capitulated. Operation Sea Lion, which in our reality remained on paper, was carried out here, albeit after the capitulation, when the resistance was broken. The occupation of Britain was especially humiliating. A country that had ruled the seas for centuries, which created the greatest empire in history, now under the German boot. The royal family was evacuated to Canada. The government in exile coordinated resistance from across the ocean. And on the islands, the Germans established a military administration. London, like Paris, became a German administrative center, the flag with the swastika over the Palace of Westminster. Big Ben continued to count the hours, but of a different, foreign history. The British, proud and unsubmissive, slowly got used to the fact that their fate was decided in Berlin. The underground resistance in Britain was harshly suppressed. The Germans did not stand on ceremony. Mass arrests, execution of hostages, concentration camps on British soil. By the early 1950s, open resistance was suppressed. Only a quiet, lurking discontent remained. Scandinavia took a different path, the path of integration. Norway and Denmark were occupied by the Germans back in the year 41. These were fast, almost bloodless operations. Denmark capitulated in a few hours. Norway held out a little longer. By the end of the 1940s, the Scandinavian countries smoothly integrated into the German system. Norwegians and Danes, like the Balts, were considered Aryan enough for assimilation. Germanization proceeded softly but steadily. German language in schools, German culture, German order. Sweden, which formally maintained neutrality, actually turned into an economic vassal of the Reich. Swedish iron ore fueled the German war industry. Swedish banks serviced Nazi finances. Neutrality turned out to be just another name for submission. Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, became a zone of puppet states and protectorates. Formally independent, in reality completely controlled by Berlin, each with its own collaborationist government, each with its own illusions of sovereignty. Poland was divided, the western part included directly into the Reich, the eastern part turned into a general government with a puppet regime. Polish culture was brutally suppressed, language, history, traditions. The Germans tried to erase the very memory of the existence of the Polish nation. Czechoslovakia became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a beautiful name for an occupied territory. Czech industry worked for the Reich. Czech workers produced German tanks and airplanes. Slovakia received the status of an independent state for obediently fulfilling any demands from Berlin. The Balkans were divided between Germany and Italy. Yugoslavia was dismembered into parts. Croatia became a puppet state under Berlin's control. Serbia, under direct occupation, the coast went to Italy. Greece also went to the Italians. although the real control remained with the Germans. Italy, the junior partner in the alliance, received its piece. The Balkans, part of North Africa, a zone of influence in the Mediterranean. But everyone understood, including the Italians themselves, that they were vassals, not equal partners. Rome depended on Berlin economically and politically. The economic integration of Europe under German leadership was a grandiose project of plunder. It was beautifully called the New European Economic Order. In reality, it meant the systematic looting of the continent in favor of Germany. Food and industrial goods were exported from France, iron ore and timber from Scandinavia, raw materials and labor from Eastern Europe. Everything flowed to Germany. Everything served to strengthen the Reich. European enterprises worked on German orders. European workers toiled for the German economy. By the early 1950s, a clear hierarchy was established. At the top, Germany itself, the metropolis of the empire. Below, racially close peoples, Scandinavians, Dutch, Flemings. They were allowed to maintain the illusion of autonomy. Even lower, Romance peoples, French, Italians, vassals with limited rights. At the very bottom, Slavs, turned into a working mass. The culture of European peoples was slowly but surely suppressed. German became the lingua franca of the continent, the language of administration, business, education. National languages remained for everyday communication, but were gradually squeezed out. In a generation or two, there might be no trace left of Europe's linguistic diversity. Collaboration became a mass phenomenon. Some cooperated out of conviction. There were enough real Nazis in all countries. Some out of fear or a desire to survive. Some out of careerism, seeing opportunities for themselves in the new order. Traitors in every country, at all levels, from simple police officers to ministers of government. But there was also resistance. In every country, even the smallest, there were those who did not submit. Partisans in the mountains of Yugoslavia and the forests of Belarus, underground workers in the cities of France and Poland, saboteurs in factories, printers of leaflets, scouts passing information to the Allies across the ocean. The resistance movement tied up significant forces of the occupiers. The Germans had to maintain garrisons, conduct punitive operations, and spend resources fighting the partisans. In response, brutal repression, execution of hostages, burned villages. But the resistance did not die. By the early 1950s, Europe under the swastika was a strange, contradictory formation. Outwardly, order, a working economy, a functioning system of governance. Beneath the surface, a boiling cauldron of hatred, resistance, and hidden hope for liberation. Old Lady Europe lived in occupation but did not die. Her soul, culture, memory, the identity of the peoples, went underground, lay low, awaited its hour. Like a seed under the snow waits for spring. You know what the most dangerous thing is about an alliance between two predators? Sooner or later, they start looking at each other and thinking, isn't it time for this one too? It has always been so in history. The victors fight over the spoils. And in this alternative reality, when the smoke over Europe and Asia had just cleared, the former allies were already eyeing each other with undisguised mistrust. Germany and Japan divided the world between themselves. Everything seems fair. 70 degrees east longitude, the line passes roughly along the Ural Mountains. To the west, German, to the east, Japanese. Simple and clear on paper. But try to draw such a line in reality when it comes to thousands of kilometers of borders, untold riches, and power over millions of people. Imagine a meeting in the year 42 when the Allies were only planning the division of non-existent spoils. German and Japanese diplomats sitting at a table, looking at maps, talking about friendship, about a joint new world order, but already calculating how to snatch more. Japan feared that Germany, having seized the European part of the Union, would not stop and would move further east. Berlin understood these fears and gave assurances. They agreed. The Far East, all of eastern Siberia, and even part of western Siberia, to the Japanese. Primorye, Sakhalin, Kamchatka were to become part of the empire directly, the rest under Japanese influence. The Germans agreed to this, but with reservations. The Trans-Siberian Railway, under joint control, natural resources, development by agreement, and most importantly, the Slavs, whom the Germans were evicting to the east. The Japanese were not supposed to let them pass beyond certain points. God forbid these untermenschen start concentrating somewhere in Siberia and creating problems. By the end of the 1940s, when both victors had settled in the captured territories, it became clear, joint rule does not work. Two different interests, two different systems, two great appetites. Japan created its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a beautiful name for an outright colonial empire. From the Pacific Ocean to the Urals, from Indonesia to Mongolia, a huge territory under Tokyo's control. Formally, it was an alliance of Asian peoples under Japanese leadership, liberated from Western imperialism. In reality, brutal occupation. China suffered especially. The Japanese invaded there back in the year 37, and the war has not stopped since. Now that Japan had a free hand, when there was no need to fear interference from America or Britain, they could do anything. The Nanking Massacre in our reality claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In this alternative history, similar atrocities were repeated again and again. The Chinese population was considered a lower race, fit only for slave labor. Millions died from bullets, starvation, disease. Chinese culture was suppressed, just as the Germans suppressed Slavic culture. The puppet government in Nanking formally governed China, but all decisions were made by the Japanese military. Chinese collaborators received scraps of power for helping to keep their people in check. Resistance continued. Partisan detachments in the mountains, underground workers in the cities. But the forces were unequal. In the Far East and Siberia, the Japanese encountered a new problem. The local population, Russians, Buryats, Yakuts, did not want to tolerate the new masters. The partisan movement flared up in the taiga and mountains. The Japanese responded in the same way as the Germans in the West. Punitive operations, burned villages, mass executions. The resources of Siberia, that is what truly interested the Japanese. Oil, coal, metals, timber. All this was needed for the development of the empire, for industry, for the army. Japanese corporations received concessions for the development of deposits. The local population was used as cheap labor, almost free, almost slaves. And on the border, running along the Urals, the two former allies began to look at each other with increasing hostility. Incidents occurred regularly. A Japanese patrol crossed the border, accidentally or intentionally. German soldiers detained Japanese citizens, suspecting them of espionage. Small skirmishes that could escalate into something bigger at any moment. Ideologically, they were also too different. German Nazism was built on racial theory, where Aryans stood at the top and everyone else was lower. Japanese militarist nationalism was also racist, but in its own way. The Japanese considered themselves a divine nation, descendants of the goddess Amaterasu, called to rule Asia. How did these two superior races relate to each other? A delicate question. The Germans recognized the Japanese as honorary Aryans, something like a compromise not to spoil the alliance. The Japanese reciprocated, calling the Germans white samurai, but beneath these courtesies lay mutual contempt. By the early 1950s, a real arms race began. Both sides understood the alliance was fragile, a conflict could happen at any moment. Germany developed new types of jet aircraft, perfected missiles, and increased tank production. The Japanese did the same, modernized the fleet, developed aviation, built fortifications along the border. The atomic program became the main trump card in this confrontation. Germany held the secret of the bomb and was not going to share it with the Japanese. Tokyo frantically tried to create its own nuclear weapon. German intelligence knew about these attempts and sabotaged them in every possible way. Japanese counterintelligence caught German spies. The Cold War was in full swing. Proxy conflicts arose, wars fought by others in disputed regions. Mongolia ended up in the Japanese zone, but the Germans tried to send their agents there, raising revolts against the Japanese. Central Asia was formally under Japanese control, but local rebels received weapons from German sources. Both sides played these games without bringing the matter to a direct clash. Diplomatic crises occurred regularly. Now a Japanese plane violated the airspace over the German zone. Now German ships went too far east into the Indian Ocean. Each time, notes of protest, threats, negotiations, compromises. And each time both sides understood just a little more, and a new war would begin. Siberia became the main bone of contention. The Germans believed that the border should be moved further east. They said the Urals was too generous. The Japanese got too much. The Japanese countered, "A treaty is a treaty. Do not dare to violate it." Behind the scenes, both sides prepared plans for military operations in case of conflict. Imagine the headquarters in Berlin and Tokyo. Generals bending over maps, moving tokens, calculating options. A tank strike through the Urals. How many divisions would be needed? A Japanese landing in Kamchatka. What naval forces are needed? An atomic strike on Vladivostok. What will the consequences be? War plans were developed in detail, just in case. Economically, they also competed. Both had captured huge territories with resources, but this is always not enough. The Germans wanted access to the Pacific ports, to the rubber of Indochina. The Japanese looked at the Ural metals, at the oil of the Caucasus. Trade between the zones was conducted, but under strict control, with huge duties and restrictions. By the mid-1950s, the situation became critical. Both regimes understood, either find a way to agree on a long-term basis, or sooner or later clash in a new world war. A war between powers possessing nuclear weapons, the latest technologies, huge armies. But there was also another danger that few thought about in Berlin and Tokyo. While the two predators watched each other, their empires were rotting from within. The conquered peoples accumulated hatred. Partisans in the forests of Belarus and the taiga of Siberia did not lay down their arms. Underground workers in the cities of Europe and Asia prepared resistance. An economy built on plunder could not grow forever. The confrontation between Germany and Japan became the new axis of world politics. Not East versus West, as in our reality, but West versus the Far East. Two empires of evil, two totalitarian systems looking at each other across a conditional line on the map. And both understood, the world is too small for both of them. And somewhere across the ocean, a third force was watching. America. Morally defeated, isolated, but not finally broken. The Americans looked at the confrontation between the two tyrants and thought, maybe our time will still come? What is it like to wake up and realize that the world has changed forever and you are left behind? America, which always considered itself a stronghold of freedom, a beacon of democracy, the savior country, suddenly found itself outside the main events. Worse, it ended up on the losing side, although it did not fight on its own territory. Imagine the autumn of '45. Acts of surrender have been signed in Europe. The swastika proudly flies over Berlin. The Japanese celebrate triumph in Asia. And across the ocean, in Washington, politicians sit in offices and realize everything has collapsed. Allies are defeated. The British government is in exile in Canada. France is under the Germans. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The psychological blow to American society was colossal. A country that was accustomed to winning, accustomed to being on top, suddenly stood alone against two gigantic empires. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, Americans felt like a besieged fortress. Panic, depression, fear, all this hung in the air. The economy collapsed almost instantly. American industry had accelerated during the war, producing weapons and equipment for the Allies. Now these markets were gone. Europe under German control did not buy American goods. The Germans established trade barriers, prohibitive duties. Asia under the Japanese, the same story. Factories began to close. Workers were laid off by the thousands. Unemployment grew every month. By the end of the 1940s, it reached 20%, as during the Great Depression, which the country had only just overcome. People stood in line for benefits, sold houses, looked for any job. The American dream turned into the American nightmare. Without European markets, American exports fell several times. Industrial giants, Ford factories, General Motors, steel mills, worked at half capacity or stood idle. Farmers could not sell grain. Europeans now bought it from the Germans, who exported it from the captured territories. Isolationism became not just a policy, it became an inevitability. America walled itself off from the outside world, like a turtle hiding in its shell. The Monroe Doctrine was revived with new force: the Western Hemisphere, the American zone, and let the rest of the world burn in hell. Strengthening the defense became the #1 priority. The entire coast, both Atlantic and Pacific, was covered with fortifications, batteries, radar stations. The fleet patrolled the waters day and night. Aviation was on combat duty. The country turned into an armed camp, ready to repel an invasion at any moment. Latin America found itself at the center of the struggle for influence. The Germans and Japanese tried to penetrate there, through trade, through propaganda, through bribing local politicians. Abwehr agents and Japanese intelligence operated in Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Local fascist movements received money and support from Berlin. America responded with tough measures. The CIA and FBI worked at full capacity, catching enemy agents. The governments of Latin American countries received generous aid, provided they remained in the American orbit. Military bases were built in Panama, Cuba, Mexico. The United States turned the entire hemisphere into its security zone. But there were also failures. Argentina, where pro-Nazi sentiments were strong, leaned toward cooperation with Germany. Brazil maneuvered between all sides, trying to extract benefits. America spent huge resources on maintaining influence in the region, but it was a game with an unpredictable outcome. Technologically, the U.S. began to lag behind, and this was the most frightening thing. The Germans had developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and atomic weapons. The Japanese were also not standing still. Their fleet and aviation were being modernized at a fast pace. America, cut off from European scientific centers, having lost many scientists, could not keep up. Yes, a stream of refugees flowed into America from Europe, scientists, engineers, intellectuals who had fled the Nazis. Einstein, Fermi, von Neumann, the luminaries of science found refuge across the ocean. They became the basis of American secret programs. But resources were scarce, and time was short. The Germans were ahead, and the gap was only increasing. The U.S. atomic program developed feverishly, but in secret. The Manhattan Project continued even after the end of the war. By the early 1950s, the Americans also created an atomic bomb, but later than the Germans, and it was humiliating. Now there were several powers with nuclear weapons in the world, and the balance of terror became even more fragile. Serious problems began inside the country. The defeat of the Allies, the economic crisis, the fear of the future, all this gave rise to radical movements. American fascism, which had existed on the fringes of politics before, came to the fore. The German-American Bund, the Silver Shirts, the America First movement, these and other groups agitated for rapprochement with Germany, for a rejection of democracy, for the establishment of a strong hand. Rallies, marches under swastika banners on American streets, a terrifying but real picture. Tens of thousands of Americans believed that the future belonged to fascism. The FBI waged a tough fight against these movements. Arrests, searches, wiretapping. Democracy under siege defended itself with not always democratic methods. McCarthyism began earlier and was more aggressive. Witch hunts, searches for internal enemies, suspicion toward everyone. But there were others, those who did not submit to defeat. New weapons were developed in secret laboratories. Saboteurs were trained in training camps. American Special Services maintained contacts with resistance movements in Europe, transferring weapons, money, instructors. The CIA became the main instrument of the secret war. Agents were dropped into occupied Europe, to France, Norway, Poland. They coordinated the actions of partisans, collected intelligence, and organized sabotage. The Germans caught them by the dozens, but new ones came to replace those caught. Ties with the resistance gave hope. If resistance is still alive in Europe and Asia, it means not all is lost. It means we can prepare for a revanche. American military personnel developed plans, how they could land in Europe if the chance arose. For now, these were just plans on paper, but they existed. Refugees continued to arrive, the few who managed to escape. Jewish communities rescued from the Holocaust, anti-fascists, former military personnel of the Allied armies. They told stories about what was happening in occupied Europe. These stories horrified and simultaneously strengthened the resolve. The world could not be left to the mercy of monsters. By the early 1950s, America was like a wounded beast, cornered but not broken. The economy slowly recovered, not thanks to foreign trade, but due to the domestic market. The military industry worked for defense. Science moved forward, albeit slower than that of its opponents. The country lived in constant tension. People knew, somewhere across the ocean, two empires of evil were dividing the world between themselves. And they knew, sooner or later, they might come here. Therefore, they had to be ready, always ready. In schools, children were taught to hide under desks in case of an atomic alarm, an absurd measure, but it created an illusion of control. Patriotic programs were broadcast on the radio. Theaters showed films about heroes, about the fight against evil, about the hope for victory. Propaganda worked at full capacity. The spirit of the nation had to be maintained. And somewhere in secret bunkers, military and politicians looked at maps of the world and wondered, was there a chance? Could the lost be ever regained? Or would America remain an isolated island in the ocean, surrounded by a hostile world? No one knew the answer, but one thing was clear: Americans were not going to surrender. As long as there is hope, as long as the heart of the nation beats, the fight continues. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but the day of reckoning will come someday, and America will be ready for it. Imagine a world where an entire generation grew up not knowing another life. For them, the swastika is not a symbol of horror, but just part of the landscape, like road signs or flags on buildings. They have never seen freedom because they were born after it disappeared. Welcome to the 1960s of the alternative reality, where the Nazi Empire celebrates its 20th anniversary. The morning of an ordinary German in Berlin begins with the radio. You turn on the receiver, and a cheerful voice tells about the achievements of the Reich, new factories, the space program, the wisdom of the Führer. No other news, no alternative viewpoints, only one truth, the state's truth. You go out into the street, and there are surveillance cameras everywhere. By the 1960s, technology had advanced significantly. Television is in almost every home, but all channels are controlled by the state. Computers appeared in administrative buildings, huge machines that store information about every citizen. The system of total control became not just an idea, but a technical reality. On every street, block wardens, people's overseers. Ordinary people, your neighbors, who watch everyone else. They see who visits whom, who says what, who behave suspiciously. Once a week, they write a report to the Gestapo. The system of denunciation became part of everyday life. Not denouncing is considered suspicious. Children go to school in uniform with youth organization symbols. Boys, in the Hitler Youth from the age of 10. Girls, in the League of German Girls. This is not voluntary, it is mandatory. Refusal is impossible. Parents will immediately be summoned to the Gestapo with the question, "Why is your child not attending classes? Are you against the Führer?" In school, they teach something completely different from what their grandfathers were taught. History is rewritten. The war is presented as a just struggle for the survival of the German people. The Holocaust is either denied or justified as a necessity. Biology turned into racial science. Children are explained why Aryans are better than other peoples, shown tables with skull measurements, taught to determine racial affiliation by appearance. Mathematics and physics are taught. The empire needs engineers. But literature, philosophy, art, all this is under rigid ideological control. No critical thinking, no questions, just memorize and repeat. The best students are those who believe fanatically, not those who think deeply. After school, classes in the youth organization, marching, drill, shooting, physical hardening, ideological lectures on the greatness of the Reich, on sacrifice for the sake of the people, on the necessity of struggle. Weakness is despised. Doubt is punished. You must be strong, merciless, loyal. One boy could not withstand the forced march and passed out. They will not pity him. They will say he is a disgrace to the Führer. A girl doubted the correctness of an order. She will be sent for re-education. The system methodically breaks the personality, turning children into obedient cogs of a huge machine. Culture exists only within the permitted frameworks. Cinema, heroic films about the war, about the exploits of German soldiers, about the greatness of the nation. Music, solemn marches, classical music in an approved interpretation. Jazz is banned as degenerative art. Rock and roll, which exploded the world in the 1960s in our reality, does not even exist here. Literature, only that which glorifies the regime, or at least does not contradict it. Books are strictly censored. Libraries are regularly checked for prohibited publications, for storing unauthorized literature, from a fine to a concentration camp, depending on the severity. Television shows parades, achievements in science and technology, educational programs about the history of the Reich. Evening broadcasts are family-oriented, but even they are woven with propaganda. The ideal German family on the screen: a hard-working father, a housewife mother, 3 healthy blonde children. Everything is clean, correct, sterile. Technological progress is indeed impressive. By the 1960s, the German space program had launched several satellites and was preparing to send a man into orbit. Jet passenger planes connect the empire from the Atlantic to the Urals. Cars have become more accessible. Every second German owns a car. Computers are still huge and primitive by the standards of our time, but they are already used for population accounting, economic planning, and military calculations. The system of total control receives a technological foundation. Every citizen is in the database, every movement is recorded, every purchase is registered. But all this is for the Aryans, for those in the metropolis, those at the top of the pyramid. But in the occupied territories of the former Union, life is completely different. A Russian worker in former Moscow, renamed something German, lives in a barracks. He works at the factory 12 hours a day, receives a ration, bread, a little porridge, occasionally potatoes. Meat is a luxury seen once a month. Clothing, 1 change per year, and that from coarse fabric. He has a passport stamped Slav 4th category. This means restrictions on everything: where to live, where to go, what to do, curfew from 8 in the evening, A ban on visiting theaters, restaurants, parks, those are for Aryans. You cannot even walk on the sidewalk if a German is walking. You must yield the way. His children attend school. 4 grades, no more. They are taught to read simple orders, count, work with their hands, no history of their people, no literature in their native language. Russian turned into the language of the kitchen and the street. German, the language of power and the future. A Ukrainian in Western Ukraine lives slightly better. He is considered more racially suitable. He is allowed to teach his children up to 6 grades. He can work not only at the factory but also as a master if he is Germanized, changes his name, learns German, rejects national identity. Many do this, seeing it as the only way up. Underground resistance by the 1960s has greatly weakened but has not disappeared. Partisans in the forests of Belarus have become a legend. Young people whisper about them as ghosts who are still fighting. Sometimes sabotage really happens. A bridge explodes, a train is derailed. The Germans respond cruelly. They shoot hostages, burn villages. Underground groups operate in the cities. They print leaflets in underground printing houses, distributing them at night. The leaflets tell the truth about life in free America, about the fact that the regime is not eternal, that liberation will come one day. For storing such a leaflet, 10 years in camps. For distributing it, execution. Old people tell grandchildren stories about pre-war life, about the time when there were no passports with racial categories, when you could move freely, study, dream. Grandchildren listen like a fairy tale. For them, it is a world of fantasies that never existed. They were born in a cage and do not know what it means to live without bars. Legends of freedom are passed on in whispers from mouth to mouth. About the country across the ocean where people elect their leaders, where you can speak your mind, where no one watches your every step. Young people listen with disbelief. They were taught that America is weak and pathetic, that only the Reich is strong and great. Economic inequality is glaring. A German engineer in Berlin lives in his own house, drives a car, goes to theaters, holidays at Mediterranean resorts. A Russian worker in the same city huddles in a barracks, walks everywhere, has never been to the theater and has not left his district. Between them, a chasm that cannot be crossed. The system of repression is well established. The secret police are everywhere, in factories, institutions, the army. The slightest suspicion, and the person disappears. He can be arrested at night, taken away, and no one will ever know what happened to him. Concentration camps are full of people, many of whom do not know what they are accused of. Denunciations have become the norm. A neighbor denounced a neighbor. He carelessly expressed himself about the Führer. A colleague denounced a colleague. He listened to forbidden radio. Even children denounce their parents. They are taught that duty to the state is above family ties. This is a society where no one can be trusted. By the year 1960, the first generation had grown up that does not remember the world before the victory of the Reich. For them, this is the norm. The swastika everywhere, the Führer in portraits, the Iron Order, the racial hierarchy. They do not know that it can be otherwise. They are the product of a system created so that the 1,000-year Reich would indeed last 1,000 years. But cracks are beginning to appear in this monolith. Not immediately noticeable, not obvious. Young people, even those raised in Nazi ideology, begin to ask questions. Why should we work so much but live so poorly? Why does only the state know the truth? Why can't we know what other countries think? These questions are still a whisper, still a secret, but they exist. And this means that even the cruelest system cannot completely kill the human desire for freedom. It hides deep down, lies low, awaits its hour. Like a seed under a thick layer of snow waits for spring, which will surely come someday. Do you know what all empires that considered themselves eternal have in common? They all collapsed. Rome thought it would stand for 1,000 years. It stood for less. Napoleon dreamed of European domination. His empire did not survive himself. And now, in this alternative reality, by the 1970s, the Nazi Empire, which promised to last a millennium, begins to crack at the seams. Imagine a huge building built on a rotten foundation. From the outside, it looks monumental: columns, arches, gilding. But inside, processes of destruction are already underway that cannot be stopped. This is exactly what the Nazi Empire looked like by the early 1970s. The first and main problem is the economy. Do you remember how I told you that the empire was built on the looting of captured territories, on the exploitation of slave labor? Well, that worked for a while, but it could not work forever. Slave labor is inefficient. They knew this in antiquity, but the Nazis decided they were smarter. A person who works under the whip for a ration of bread and water is not interested in the result. He will do the minimum not to be punished. Production defects, sabotage, low productivity, all this became the norm in enterprises that used forced labor. By the 1970s, this resulted in a systemic crisis. Industry worked at half capacity. New factories built with pomp did not yield the promised return. The quality of products fell. German goods, which were previously famous for their reliability, now yielded even to American ones, not to mention Japanese ones. Attempts to squeeze more out of the workforce only led to increased resistance. Tightening of norms, increasing the workday, reducing rations, all this caused discontent. Underground strikes, acts of sabotage became more frequent. The empire turned into a huge prison where the overseers could no longer keep track of all the prisoners. The demographic crisis became another blow to the system. The genocide that destroyed millions of people in the 1940s and 1950s now resulted in a shortage of working hands. Paradox: the empire killed those who could have worked for it. Deportations continued, but there were no new territories to capture. The world was divided between Germany and Japan. The German population could not fill the resulting void. The birth rate in Germany itself was not as high as the ideologues had hoped. Programs to encourage large families yielded results, but insufficient ones. The colonists who were resettled to the east faced difficulties: a harsh climate, a hostile local population, isolation. Many returned back, and then Hitler died. Imagine what happens to a regime built around the cult of one man when that man leaves. In 1974 or 1975, when the Führer was already over 80, he died. From old age, from illness, it does not matter. What matters is what began afterward. The struggle for power unfolded instantly. Several groups in the party leadership, each with its own ambitions. The military wanted to strengthen their influence. The SS believed that only they were worthy to rule the empire. Industrialists pulled the blanket over themselves. A hidden conflict began, threatening to escalate into open confrontation. A system where all decisions were made by one person proved incapable of collective management. Disputes, intrigues, and the struggle for positions paralyzed the administration. Decisions were postponed, reforms stalled. The empire continued to exist by inertia, but without clear leadership. This was immediately felt in the occupied territories. When the center weakens, the outskirts begin to raise their heads. The partisan movement that had been smoldering in the forests of Belarus and Siberia flared up with new force. Sabotage increased. Entire regions slipped out of the occupiers' control. German garrisons had to be reinforced, but the troops were demoralized. Why die for territories that they could not hold anyway? In the cities of the former Union, underground groups became active. Leaflets were printed not in single copies, but by the thousands. Underground radio broadcast at night, telling the truth about what was happening in the world. Young people who grew up under occupation began to ask uncomfortable questions. The most interesting thing is the youth movement inside Germany itself. The generation born after the war, raised in the Nazi system, suddenly began to doubt. Not everyone, of course. Many remained loyal to the ideology. But there were those who read forbidden books, listened to forbidden music, and thought forbidden thoughts. Technology gave them tools. Underground tape recordings of Western music were passed from hand to hand. Samizdat, books and articles photocopied on typewriters, was distributed among students. Secret meetings in basements and apartments where they discussed what could not be said aloud. The authorities tried to suppress these sprouts of dissent, but failed. The more they suppressed, the more discontented people appeared. Technological stagnation became evident by the 1970s. A system where free thinking is forbidden, where any deviation from dogma is punished, cannot be innovative. German scientists worked within rigid ideological frameworks. Many areas of research were closed as degenerate or non-Aryan. Cybernetics, genetics, even some sections of physics were criticized for not conforming to Nazi ideology. As a result, Germany began to lag behind. America, despite isolation, continued to develop technology. There was freedom of thought there. Scientists could seek the truth, not tailor results to ideology. Even Japan, with its militaristic regime, was more flexible. Germany, on the other hand, froze, like a dinosaur that cannot adapt to the changed world. The space program, which was a source of pride in the 1960s, stalled. Plans for the colonization of the moon were postponed. Rockets exploded at launch. Problems multiplied and solutions were not found. Bureaucracy, corruption, the incompetence of appointees who were chosen not for ability but for loyalty, all this suffocated progress. Economic problems worsened. The empire, built on plunder, exhausted the resources for plunder. The occupied territories were already squeezed to the limit. There could be no new captures. Japan would not allow it, and fighting Japan was too risky. They had to switch to a normal economy. But how? The entire system was built on coercion, not incentives. Inflation began to rise. Goods shortages became the norm even in Germany itself. Queues for groceries, the rationing system, the black market. The privileged position of Aryans was eroding. When everyone is doing poorly, the difference between good and very bad is no comfort. By the end of the 1970s, it became clear the system was on the verge. There were several possible scenarios. The first, gradual liberalization, as happened with some authoritarian regimes in our history. But this requires reformers in the leadership, and they were not there. The second scenario, the breakup of the empire. National outskirts fall away one after another. First, the farthest ones, Central Asia, under Japanese control, permanently goes to Japan. Then the Caucasus, a national liberation movement rises there. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, each tries to regain independence. Germany shrinks to its historical borders. The third, revolution. A popular uprising, similar to those that overthrew tyrants in our history. It starts with something small, a strike at a factory, a student demonstration. The authorities try to suppress it, but this only ignites the fire. The uprising spreads, the army refuses to shoot at the people or switches to their side. The regime collapses in weeks. The fourth, civil war. Different groups in the elite begin an open struggle for power. The empire plunges into chaos. Every region, every nationality tries to use the moment for its own purposes. Blood, destruction, millions of victims. But in the end, the fall of the old order. History teaches us totalitarian regimes are not eternal. They can seem indestructible. They can instill fear in generations. But they have an internal vice. They are based on violence and lies. And violence and lies cannot be the foundation for long existence. Historical memory, that is what cannot be killed. Old people told their grandchildren about life before the war. Books hidden in basements preserved the truth. Songs in native languages, sung in secret, transmitted the spirit of freedom. This memory awaited its hour, like smoldering coals waiting for the wind to burst into flames. the hope for liberation lived in the hearts of millions. In the underground apartments of Paris and Moscow, in the partisan detachments of the Siberian taiga, in the student dormitories of Berlin, everywhere there were those who did not submit, who believed that darkness cannot last forever, that dawn will definitely come. And here is the lesson for us, living in the real reality. This alternative history reminds us, freedom is fragile. It can be lost imperceptibly, step by step. First, freedom of speech is taken away, they say, so as not to offend anyone's feelings. Then freedom of assembly, so as not to disrupt order. Then comes control, surveillance, denunciations. And now a generation grows up in a cage, not knowing that it can be otherwise. But history also teaches, even the most terrible regimes fall, sooner or later, because the human desire for freedom cannot be completely killed. It is stronger than fear, stronger than propaganda, stronger than repression. It is hidden deep within human nature and awaits its moment. In this alternative history, by the 1980s, the empire of the Thousand-Year Reich stood on the brink of a precipice. Maybe it would have collapsed with a crash, like the Berlin Wall in our reality. Or maybe it would have slowly disintegrated, like the Soviet Union. Or it would have exploded in the fire of revolution and civil war. We do not know exactly how this story would have ended, but we know the main thing: it would have ended. Because tyranny cannot be eternal. Because truth is stronger than lies. Because freedom is not a privilege, but the inalienable right of every person. And as long as there is at least one person who remembers this, hope is alive.